El radioarte es la inspiración que se le hace al receptor al oyente que escucha a que pueda configurar un escenario propio. Se apela mucho al aspecto subjetivo del radialista, de la persona que elabora esta pieza. Debe ser armónico, es decir, sonar bien. Es un género totalmente libre en su construcción.
Totalmente libre en su construcción.
Radio art is the invitation that we make to the receiver, the radio listener. Time to configure the space of their own. We appeal to the person who creates the piece, the artist's subjectivity. It has to be harmonic.
Los ingredientes con los que vamos a trabajar son los elementos del lenguaje de la radio. Con música, con efectos, con la voz, la palabra y con el silencio.
It has to sound good. It is a completely free genre when it comes to framework.
Música, con efectos, con la voz, la palabra y con el silencio.
There is no rigid diagram or structure that allow us to design radio art. You're listening to the noise of the message.
Para una mejor escucha, recomendamos el uso de auriculares.
Okay, that's complicated usually. So my name is Stefan Goldmann. I am a musician based in Berlin, Germany. I mostly do electronic music, or if I do something that's not electronic music, it's usually somehow related to something that comes from electronic music. So just to give an example for the latter, I've, for instance, done music for ensembles where I compose an electronic piece of music, but you don't get to hear the original. So in between the original and the ensemble, there are other composers writing an arrangement for the ensemble the way they understand the electronic sounds. And in the actual concert, you hear 2 or 3 versions which are different. So you don't hear the original, you just hear the translation from one medium to the other. So that would be an example for me somehow doing music that's electronic and not electronic at the same time. Apart from that, I've been doing pretty much everything you can connect to music somehow. So I have a studio, I produce music, I DJ, I have a label, I perform live more or less. I have a music publishing company, I program a festival. I write about music sometimes. So I've been doing this for a while, so over the years, just to keep it interesting, I guess I kept adding more and more different aspects of seemed interesting to me in music. So in a nutshell, that's what I do.
considering that whole theoretical framework, what is your concept of recordings in that sense?
So recordings are very interesting because for the first time they put things into the same plane as notation. What I mean by this is that I didn't come up with this. Other people have described this in detail long before I ever thought of it. But what notation represents is the stuff that can be represented in categories. So, there's a difference in category between C and C sharp. But anyone who's ever played an acoustic instrument, of course, knows there are all sorts of nuances in between. If you play a violin, you can just move your finger up and down a bit and the pitch changes, so it's never exactly C and never exactly C sharp, so it's always somewhere. And usually it moves, so you have articulation where you move the frequency. But you can't put that into notation meaningfully. By meaningful, I mean it can't be reproduced. If you have like very subtle variations of pitch, it just doesn't make sense to put them in notation because no one can replay the exact same thing. Or if you write like the most complicated rhythmic structure, it just can't be reproduced exactly. But we know by experience that some things can be reproduced from notation. Now, what a recording does is that anything can be reproduced. So for the first time in history, you can literally play something and listen back to it and have every aspect of it reproduced, except maybe, for the exact spatial component. So of course, you have an acoustic instrument in a room, you have a more complex situation than a recording with a microphone and some stereo playback. But still, just amount of stuff that becomes possible to capture has increased by a magnitude that's unprecedented in the history of music. So it changed the entire perspective of what music is and what it can do. So now let me think, let's say, I guess this began in the 1950s, that we have something of a recording arts that went beyond just capturing stuff as is. But people figured out recording actually allows you to go beyond what you can do in real time. So one of the first instances people quote is, this like early rock and roll thing where they recorded a singer and a guitarist and a drummer and a bass player on tape. And then they played back the tape on a speaker in the bathroom and they got this echo. And then they recorded the echo and mixed both together onto a new tape. So something came into the recording that was not part of the original performance. So fast forward a couple of decades, my work situation today is that I can sit in the studio and I can basically tweak some random combinations on a synthesizer. I can just turn some knobs, press some key. And because of recording or MIDI and recording, I can evaluate that endlessly. So I can basically put a loop on repeat. And without knowing what I do, I can press that, or anyone, not just me, of course. Anyone could do that. You press a few things and then you listen back to the loop. And listening repetitively changes your perception. So you listen to it for 2 hours sometimes. I mean, this is literally what people do. You then get to evaluate, and you can, if it's a situation where you can go back to the original and just tweak details, you can get into depth. Otherwise, you wouldn't capture by ear. Of course, like every musician working with an acoustic instrument or with their voice, they work on nuance all the time. But you never get to revisit the same nuance twice unless you record it. So I think that's a fundamental shift in what music does, and a lot of formal innovation stems from this fact of people being able to go back to something that happens once and add up to it or change it repeatedly, often hundreds of times. Like modern pop recordings, there are like hundreds of edits. So this has become a cultural technique that's universal, it's global. This is not limited to the places where any of those pieces of technologies were invented. So it's not like only US American or German or Japanese people who use those things. So anywhere in the world, people use recording technology, and they enter this feedback loop with recording technology, which changed music all over the world. That's my impression of what recording does.
Fantastic. Wonderful.
El ruido es el mensaje.
Okay, thank you very much. How is your process to build your sound concept?
Okay. Yeah, so what I'm trying to do usually is to not repeat myself, at least in some aspect. Of course, like a lot of stuff repeats all the time. So basically, if you release 2 stereo recordings, you've repeated yourself. But, because I've been doing music for a couple of years, just in order to keep this interesting for myself, I kind of posed the requirement to myself that I have to justify why I'm doing something. I mean, I might do it, but if I release it publicly, there must be some reason there. So at least I have to find some, you could call it conceptual gateway of how to structure my work. So even, if I repeat specific aspects which I've used elsewhere, so it's not like I don't reuse sounds or instruments or approaches, but I have to find a new way to use them. So as the example I gave you of trying like different meters in rhythmic concepts, I could did the same with scales or with tuning. Just, instead of like, typically if you switch on like a standard synthesizer, there's a keyboard attached to it, and it has this tuning. But of course, this is like entirely arbitrary, it doesn't have to be like this. And some decades ago, people had to do this by hand, if they wanted to change the intonation or the tuning of the synthesizer, they had to use the little pitch bend wheel on the left and do alternations to pitches in real time. So a lot of Arab musicians or Middle Eastern musicians, like also Turkish or Iranian musicians, because traditionally they use different scales, but they got these Japanese synthesizers that were just tuned in an equal temperament intonation, so it didn't work for the music they wanted to do. And they came up with those techniques, which I find astonishing, to tweak all the pitches in real time by bending like this little wheel which bends the pitch of each tone. So it's very expressive, and I found that very interesting. So at some point, for instance, I'd be looking into designing my own scales or my own intonation contours of changing standard pitch, and then to see how this affects all else. So even, if I'm entirely within standard of like all the rhythms and all the timbres, like, the sound patches work. If you just change the intonation of everything, it changes in my experience. So I try to set like this sort of conceptual gateway and to see what it does and how I can make the rest work with it, and if I can get to any interesting results. And, fair enough, often things just don't work, so I have to throw it away. I go back to it 10 years later, and then I figure out, okay, I should have done this and that, and now it sounds interesting at least. So usually I'll have to find first some justification of doing stuff, which would mean doing it kind of differently, even if it's just small steps or just a detail, and then to see what actually happens with it. So to some degree it's very planned, then to a vast degree it's very experimental, just trying to find your way in an unfamiliar environment because you just changed everything. So it's like you find yourself in a house where all the doors are on the ceiling, and now you try to find your way from the kitchen to the bathroom. And that's kind of my situation. So that's like usually the process, figuring it out. And then there's just like the clerical stuff, such as getting it all produced properly, mixed down, recorded, and then to somehow get it out into the world. So I have a label where I can do this myself, luckily. And it's been kind of the best way for me to do this. Sometimes I also work elsewhere, or I have commissions where people ask me to do something for a specific occasion. So usually there's something to be considered in relation to this. So either, let's say, it's music for some installation where you're working with a photographer, and so I have to look at the images and see like, okay, how can I make this work in some sequence with sound? And it's always just, like applying what you know to something that's new in the situation, trying to make those things work in some way.
following this line of reasoning, how is it that your approach to silence, I was thinking about Ghost in Viola.
Yeah.
How is it that your approach to silence combines with this part of rhythmic key that is almost always associated to Latin American folk music? How is it that it relate to, how is it that relate in this case in particularly? And how is it that it came out as an idea, as a concept, as an idea to be followed up by María Chavez, etc.?
Yeah. Okay, so Ghost Himiola is actually a remix of a previous record, which was called Grand Himiola, which was, again, a derivation of music I had done for a dance company in Mannheim in Germany. So this was like a stage performance with live musicians. And I had done basically different sorts. So the rhythmic bass of this original music in the background was different sorts of hemiolas. So basically, hemiola usually is considered like a rhythm of 3/2. But of course, you can do this with any combinations. You can do 4/3 or 5/2 or whatever you like, basically. And of course, some of those aren't used pretty much anywhere traditionally. But polyrhythms of 3/2, they're used in many cultures. And if you get very basic, it's funny because like many people recognize something they know from elsewhere. So, like the more basic you get, the more people recognize something known to them, which is also a very nice thing because you show people commonalities rather than differences. So the original record then, which came out, it had those locked grooves. So which means, there's music which is put into a loop on the record and you put on the needle and it just repeats itself forever. And just using the difference between running speeds on a record. So the standard running speeds on any turntable are 33.3 and 45 RPM. And that's very close to what you need to get a hemiola done. So it's basically 4/3, or which you could divide into 2/3 or 3/2. So you can have like a binary rhythm on one record and a ternary rhythm on the other. So you can have this as a DJing toolkit for hemiolas, and that's what I did with the first record. And then I don't even remember where the idea with the empty record came from, but I had heard about the practice of DJs to cut beats into empty locked grooves. So usually any record you take, it has this run-out groove at the end of the record. So when the music is finished, right, the needle goes into this final loop and it just goes into a circle forever. And we all know this if we have ever listened to a record and forgotten to take off the needle at the end. It just goes in a circle forever and makes those noises which happen because the loop is closing. So there's like this piece where the groove goes into this final circle, and every time the needle goes past that point, it clicks. So if you're used to handling vinyl, as I've been doing for a long time because I was a DJ with vinyl records before, so I'm very familiar to those rhythmic qualities of those locked grooves on the end of records. So at some point I figured I could do a remix of the record by erasing my original content and just having the empty loops and allow people to take a knife and cut their own beats, basically. And it turns out, I didn't know this before, but it turns out you can actually plan what kind of sound you get out of it. So if you make a long cut along the groove, it tends to be a more like low frequency, bassy kind of sound. And if you do a very small, just, the point of a needle or the point of a knife mark on the groove, you get a click, like a high frequency sound. So you can actually, just looking at the groove, you can plan something like a beat. So if you take the circle and you make 4 marks, like one on the upside, just like north, south, west, east, and you make them long, you just get like something reminiscent of a 4/4 kick drum. And if you make little pointy marks in between those, you get something like a hi-hat. So you get like this basic techno house framework. And you can plan this optically, so you don't even have to listen back to it before you cut it. And so then having 2 records of those, you can just in real time, you cut something on one record and you put on the needle and you put it in loop mode. And then you take the second record and you make another cut and you mix this in so you can build those rhythms in real time. So another thing which this hemiola structure or the 2 different speeds do is that you can get beyond the temporal limit of the locked groove. So this locked groove takes a specific amount of time. I'd lie to you. I think it's something like 0.8 seconds or something like this for one rotation. I'm not sure. So it's very short. It's like, one rotation is just like There's probably more, but it's over within like a very short time frame. But if you layer 2 at different speeds, you extend the time until that loop repeats. So you can go beyond the physical limitation of the medium by just combining those 2 loops, right? Because you need one loop to play back 3 times and the other 2 times to get the full rhythm represented again. So the complete loop of 2 records mixed in at those 2 standard speeds adds up to having to listen to the whole thing 2 or 3 times respectively. So you exceed, I'm not sure if I'm explaining this well, but this makes it possible to exceed the limitation of the record. And that's something that I found very interesting, that you have like a physical record that just seems to, say like, well, this is what you can do with me, this is the duration you can have, this is the dynamics you can have, this is the noise level, deal with it or don't. But you can go beyond it. And of course, there's this whole tradition of turntablism does exactly this, to just make the medium audible by scratching it, and B, going beyond what the medium provides you with. So it totally makes sense to me to go to someone like María Chavez. I was lucky that I didn't know her before. So I just contacted her on a random chance, and it turned out somebody had given her this record as a birthday present. And then it turned out we have the same birth date. So we have our birthdays on the same day. So it's like, okay, we got to do this. So she did this 1-hour remix just with this record as a source material. And I think it's also the first fully digital work which she did, ironically. So she transformed, I sent her a bunch of those records, so she broke some, she scratched some, but you don't hear that anymore because she transformed it so much. So it's her first work where she actually didn't record it as a performer just with turntables, but she took that performance and then composed with that material. So it was also like a totally different way of working for her. So that's something that I couldn't plan possibly, but it just turned out like this. So I'm very happy with how this one went.
This album that you create, to me, it's the first time that I can see the physical representation of the silence in this album. And you can make the silence sound as you want.
Yeah, so, it's not silence, right? Because there is noise. So, and each loop sounds differently. Those loops, in order to be pressed onto a record, they have to be cut first. So there was a mastering engineer cutting those empty grooves, and each one sounds different before even you do anything to it. So there's already like an inherent structure because it's impossible to cut them uniformly. So I think it's deceptive to think of it as silence because that's not what it is. I mean, it is silence in the sense that there is no input. So there is no, we have lots of works in music, you know, like there's no input, mixer, experimental music and so on. So there's lots of stuff that utilizes things that have no content, no signal. So in one way, it was also a joke because at the time when I did it, there was this whole talk about digitization and stuff being freed from the medium, as in, you know, you're a musician and in order to distribute your music, you depend on this physical object. And if you are in Chile, for instance, and I'm in Germany, you know, it takes so much to get this object out to you. So there's like so much effort and expenses involved to just get this object so you can hear it. So there was this whole almost ideology saying like, well, you know, like now as everything is digital, we get rid of all this, which of course isn't true because you still have all this stuff that you need to get a digital transmission from me depositing a file somewhere and you being able to play it back in your location. So I just also took the opportunity to kind of mock digitization and say like, well, if the content got rid of the carrier, where's the carrier? So the record I did was the carrier without the content. So it's like basically like, so here's your digitization. Somebody took out the content of the loops and that's what's left. So, but silence is an interesting one because it's not really silent even before you make it sound. But it's, I agree, there's no music entering the record the way it has been imagined that it should enter the record.
I think that the silence is a cultural concept as noise. They are a cultural concept. When you say that there is no silence, there are samples of noise, to me, it's one of the representation of the silence, for example. So,
well,
see, yes.
Sorry if I may contradict. So I believe the technical definition of noise is that you have, or at least in the concept of so-called white noise, it is all sounds at once, just not in phase. So it's like every single frequency in the spectrum out of phase. Whereas if you take all those frequencies and you put them in phase, so they start simultaneously, what you get is a click. So you get the opposite. So you get like a full-on level immediately from 0 to something, and that results in a click technically. So noise is just our inability to see a pattern because it's masked by all those things going on, which is also a metaphor. You know, if you're in a room and like 1,000 people are talking, you don't hear anything, but it doesn't mean no one is speaking. So silence is something different, but then again, people experimented with this. I remember, I don't know where that is, but at some point, universities were building those silent spaces. So there's like full absorption in a room. So where every sound gets absorbed, there are no reflections from the walls. And you can use this room for measurements, or it's used in industry if you want to measure something without getting a room response. So if you enter such a room, I have done so, but I have never been alone in such a room. But I've read that when people do, they begin to hear sounds from their own organism. So your ear picks up blood pressure movements, for instance, or your own heartbeat. So your body starts amplifying signals coming out of your own body, which otherwise are masked by surrounding sound. So we literally have no situation where we could experience actual silence. Because, the moment you tune out the environment, we just start hearing ourselves. Which I don't know what it means, but that's just the way I guess it is.
El ruido es el mensaje.
So, the importance of noise and silence in your work.
Oh my God. Yeah, I think I basically, with the ghost in Yoda is a good one because all those things are represented in there. And in a way, I very much like it when it becomes playful. So, you can take it all as a joke, but you can also get very serious about it because it's so basic that it just represents, or it poses some question about our whole relationship of music, medium, expression, handling the medium as a consumer, or how much participation is there in consuming music. If you go back to 1950s, German philosophy on music consumption, they could have never predicted that people would start developing something such as turntablism or scratching a record. So they thought that's a fully passive thing. And I like using such basic things as silence or noise. I mean, noise is the opposite of basic, but it becomes basic in terms of perception. It's so complicated that you just hear it as one uniform thing. You can use those things to make other stuff visible, so to speak, but just to pose a question where people go okay, actually, what does this mean and why do we use this like that? And such as, this inversion I talked about between medium and content and digitization. You could just so take it backwards. So that kind of stuff is kind of, it's funny, when I get together with my friends, we love to just have a beer and a laugh over such ideas, but you could just as well get like very serious about it. So I also like that it's very open in what people see in it. It doesn't mean just one thing, so anyone can take it and take it further to somewhere. So if I can get to like such basic things such as silence and still express something with it that hasn't been done a million times, that would be amazing, because like most of the basic things have been done, in fact. You know, we've had kind of avant-garde arts that have been concerned with finding first principles for like 100 years. You know, people went back and like, okay, we've been drawing pictures, but you know, we could break that down. Like, why do we represent stuff like this? And eventually get a white canvas. And then the next thing is somebody burns that canvas. So people have been in this competition to find the root of everything. And if you still can find something that's somehow basic, that's amazing to me. That's still possible, which just shows how much, or let's say, how many foundations stuff has, which we still deal with. So there's just not like one or two or three things. There are like literally thousands of aspects going into like a complex cultural product, such as music or a picture or speech. So that's my interest. If I can find the most simple, what's the English expression? I think it's like sorry, English is not my first language, so sometimes I don't know expressions, like the most simple denominator, something like this. Anyway, so just meaning if you can find like the first principle of something, that's something amazing to me.
Respect, I was considering your previous answers, and it suddenly surfaced the idea of music as a kind of magic.
Not in the sense of the Queen's song title, but in the sense of when you were mentioning what happens with the synthesizer, that you start sort of getting a waveform that sometimes sort of hypnotizes you.
Is music still a sort of realm for this magical processes to come up or to show up? Or I consider magic as not like tricks, but mostly as a sort of a way of understanding the world, which is what the indigenous peoples always deal with. So in that concept, would you say that music is a sort of realm for these magical aspects of life and the universe to show up?
Oh, absolutely. I think, you know, every generation has to discover basically the same things over and over again. You know, we have very limited capacity despite all the information storing technology or written language or anything. We have very little capacity to actually pass on insight. So, of course, we can see representations of how people before us dealt with stuff, but basically until we try it ourselves, we just don't know. So we're every time in the situation that we have to discover everything again. And music in particular, it's so complex. And as I tried to say earlier, I think this complexity and the interconnectedness of all those aspects makes for very little changes somewhere to give different results. So even if people find themselves in something that is, like 98% the same situations as the people before them, and that's like 96% the same situation as the people before them, it's still a whole new thing every time. So even today people go back to stuff where we thought like, okay, literally everything has been done with a distorted electric guitar and a drum kit and a bass guitar and a microphone for a singer. But still people find new stuff in those tools. Some time ago, there were discussions about the system of copyright, which seems to encompass more and more societies. That there was some people expressed the fear that basic ideas get copyrighted and taken out of circulation. And I think this is a complete misconception of how many ideas we have at the disposal. So I think the way copyright works, you can only copyright something specific. So you can never copyright a concept. That's something for patent law, but within, let's say melodies, if you just change one or two things, you have a different melody essentially. I mean, sometimes, there are like legal cases where people get confused about that thing and they think something is similar, so it must be the same. But essentially, our hearing is very, very capable in discriminating 5,000 different melodies on the basis of the same 5 tones. So, just little changes of sequence, of timing, of expression, and we can literally say like, okay, there's another blues song. I'm sure there are fans that can distinguish 5,000 blues songs, which have all, the same kind of tones going in there. Immediately know, okay, this is this and this is not that, despite being made out of a very limited set of parametric values going in there, so to speak. So because it's endless, there's no chance that we ever exhaust the possibilities, even if we were stuck with the tools we have today. So, I mean, people have been stuck with the tools for millennia, I'm not talking about the last 2,000 years, but if you go back 5,000 years, and if you look down from there, how slowly technology evolved. So in archaeological sites, you can sometimes see that specific tools didn't change for 50,000 years, or for I don't want to get wrong on the numbers here, but tens of thousands of years, some things didn't change in some places. So for instance, in archaeological sites in Australia, they can literally trace a certain piece of technology, which, the way it is done is culturally determined. So it is, they could have absolutely changed it if they wanted to. They were able to keep on to a shape of things that had a magical meaning. That's why it stayed the same. 46,000 years. So it's impossible that within the next decade we can exhaust anything, culturally speaking. On the basis of physical resources, that's a different question. But in the terms of the realm of ideas, of expression, of communication between people, it's an endless field. And the struggle historically hasn't been of knowing how to move on, but how to hold on to things so we don't forget. That's always been the challenge, to hold on to knowledge. So I don't see any restrictions in music or culture moving forward. More of the question is like, what do we want to hold on and how do we achieve that?
El ruido es el mensaje.
Vamos por más, dice la rana, escúchame, ¿eh? Esto recién empieza.
Vamos chegando uma caixa ainda, promoção total para você, aproveita. É loucura total o sorvete, ó. Barato hoje, R$8,50, viu? Tá bom, você? Tá bom isso aí, tá bom? Tá bom.